If you'll indulge me in an analogy, and I can liken our time in Lamentations to a journey, it'd be fair to say it's not been an uneventful trip to the shop at the end of the road. It's been bumpy, it's been uncomfortable, it's been emotional. There have been moments where maybe we've wanted to say, are we nearly there yet? But actually, we're not quite sure where we're going. And we're not quite sure if we want to get there. And now we've come to the end of the book. We're not sure if it feels like much of a destination. It doesn't feel like we've made it. In fact, I noticed a few of you were sort of turning the page to see what lay beyond verse 22, because it just feels like such an unsatisfactory resolution. At the loose ends, they're not all tied up in a nice, neat bow. We've still got loads of questions that might remain unanswered. But of course, actually, if you've known suffering, perhaps if you've particularly known deep suffering, none of that will come as a surprise. Because that's not what happens in suffering. Things don't get tied up in neat bows. You don't always get taken to a comfortable destination, at least in this life. And so maybe it's not a surprise that this chapter doesn't lead us there. But it doesn't leave us where we began, actually, in the dust of Lamentations chapter 1 and the destruction of the city there. Because it does do something for us. It does tell us where to go in the midst of our pain and suffering. It does point us to the Lord, and it does that by giving us three prayers. I've stuck them on the outline if you have that in front of you. They come in verses 1 and verse 19 and verse 21. Three prayers. First, remember, Lord, what has happened to us. Then second, you, Lord, reign forever. And third, restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. And we're going to look at each of those three prayers in turn, and we're going to think about what it might look like for us to pray them ourselves in the midst of our own personal pain and suffering. As I said, the first prayer comes in verse 1. Have a look there with me. Lamentations 5, verse 1. Remember, Lord, what has happened to us. Look and see our disgrace. As God's people gather together to pray this lament, the first thing they ask God to do is remember them. And when the Bible speaks of God remembering, you may know it. There's a few ways in which it's not the same as us remembering. It doesn't mean what we instinctively think it might mean. So when God remembers in the Bible, it's not that he's calling something to mind. Rather, it's that he's taking action. It's like your spouse or your flatmate saying, please remember the milk when you go to the shops. Now, we all know this, don't we? But they're not asking you to pause in the middle of the supermarket and call that pint of semi-skimmed to mind. Milk. It's so good on cereal. It's full of calcium. Just don't put it in your tea when it's gone off. That's not what they're asking you to do. When they say remember the milk, they want you to pick some up and go to the till and buy it and bring it home. They want you to act as you remember. And that's the way that God remembers. That's what happens when God remembers in the Bible. So let me give you a few examples. When God remembered Noah on the ark, what happened? The floodwaters began to subside. When God remembered the Israelites and their enslavement in Egypt, he put into motion the events that would lead to the Exodus and to their freedom. When God remembered Hannah, after her heartfelt prayer in the temple, she conceived Samuel. When God remembers his people, he acts, he does something. And so at the beginning of Lamentations 5, when the people pray, remember, Lord, what has happened to us, they're asking him to act. to do something. And I guess the question is, well, what is it the people of Jerusalem want God to do at the beginning of Lamentations 5? As God remembers what happened to them, what is it they want? What is it they want? I wonder what you think. Surely they're wanting him to be merciful, to be forgiving in the face of their sin. As they call to the Lord and they say, look on our disgrace, they're saying, Lord, we have nothing to offer. We're spiritually bankrupt. We can't save ourselves. We need your mercy. We need your forgiveness. Remember us, Lord. One of the other ways that God's remembering is different to our remembering is that he doesn't need to remember things because he's forgotten them. Unlike us, he's all-knowing, he's unchanging, he doesn't forget things, and so he doesn't need to remember them in the same way that we do. But knowing that makes what happens next in Lamentations 5 a bit strange, because in the next, 16 verses, the people together, they go on to describe their disgrace as if God needed to be reminded of what had happened. Have a look, verse 2. Their homeland is no longer their own. Our homes have gone to foreigners. Verse 3, they've lost their families as they become fatherless widows. And they don't even have, verse 4, the most basic of supplies, water and wood. They've experienced great loss. And they've been oppressed, and they describe that in the next few verses. They're being relentlessly pursued, verse 5. They're at our heels, we're weary, we find no rest. They've been made to submit to the surrounding nations, to Egypt and Assyria, just to get the food they need to survive. Verse 8, they're enslaved by slaves. Utterly oppressed, no one to free them. And as it goes on, it's just a picture of utter humiliation. Verse 9, despite them risking everything to get food, they're famished with hunger, verse 10. Verse 11, their women have been sexually abused, and verse 12, their princes have been tortured. Verse 13, the young have been robbed of their youth. And verse 14, the elders have been robbed of their authority. And in verse 15, you get this really somber summary. Joy is gone from our hearts. Our dancing has turned to mourning. But if God doesn't forget, why do they detail all this? If God does remember in the way that we forget, why spend most of this chapter, this lament, cataloguing their sorrows? Here's why. It's not that it's for God's benefit. Rather, it's for their own. You see, with the particular type of suffering in view here that God's people were experiencing, that the suffering that comes as a result of sin, when you consciously bring to mind that sin and you consider the consequences it has had, when you do that, it leads to a sort of heartfelt cry to God to remember us, to have mercy upon us. Because when you do that, you realize there's no health in us, and you realize that we have nothing to offer. But if we never do that, if we never give time to consider our sin, at least in my experience, we never find ourselves crying out to God because we're quite comfortable in our mess and we're affirmed by our culture. And we never really notice that we're not okay. And so the people, they remember their sin to drive them to pray, Lord, remember us. Now, don't mishear me. I'm not encouraging a sort of morbid fascination with our sin. I just want us to own it enough that we might get to where they get to in verses 16 to 18. Have a look. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. And because of this, our hearts are faint. Because of these things, our eyes grow dim. For Mount Zion, which lies desolate, with jackals prowling over it. Do you see where their remembering of their sin gets them to? It gets them to a place where they acknowledge that sin, where they own the destruction that's brought upon themselves. Woe to us. It gets them to a place where they mourn that sin, to where their hearts are faint, to where their eyes have grown dim, and they recognize the effects it has as they look out over Mount Zion, over Jerusalem, utterly desolate. When we remember our sin and we get to the place where we can say those words, do you know what we do then? We really pray. Verse 1, remember, Lord, what has happened to us. Look with us on mercy. Look upon us in mercy. And that's a really good thing for us to do as individuals. But as I said at the start, Lamentations 5, it's a corporate prayer. It's an all-together prayer. And so I take it's a good thing for us to do as a church, which is why on our sheets you'll see our coffee time question is a bit different this week. It asks something a bit different. It says, what might we need to repent of together as a church to seek God's transforming forgiveness? What are the ways in which we need to pray Lamentations 5, not just on our own, but all together? And if that is something you end up talking about and you feel able, please do come and let me know, because I'd be really interested to think together with you about the things that you thought of. To ask, is there ways in which we need to pray this together? And as we have those conversations, as we reflect indeed on our own lives, we can do so confident that the Lord does remember, that he does look on his people with mercy. After all, what was it that thief said on the cross to Jesus? Luke 23, the thief said to Jesus, Jesus, remember me. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. And how does Jesus reply? Well, Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. We can pray in our suffering, and perhaps particularly if our suffering comes as a result of our sin, remember, Lord, what has happened to us. And we can do so confident that our God acts in mercy to those who pray that prayer to him. That's the first prayer to pray. The second, as I said, comes in verse 19. Have a look there with me. You, Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. It's a big, bold declaration that God is in charge, that he is sovereign, that he is the powerful, strong, almighty Lord over all. And that bold confidence is followed by an anguished question. Verse 20, why do you always forget us? Why do you forsake us so long? Lord, if you're in charge, why haven't you remembered us with mercy? You're powerful to do that. Why hasn't it happened yet? Why do you forsake us? God, you're in charge, and yet nothing is happening. I wonder if that's a tension you've felt in your Christian life. Lord, you're in charge, nothing is happening. Lord, you could make my suffering go away, and yet it remains. I wonder if that's something you've had to wrestle with. As I was preparing this week, I read a bit of a book written by a guy who's known a lot of suffering in his life. He's a minister in a church in the States called Mark Vrogrop. He's written a book called Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, and he reflects on this tension between God being in charge and his people still suffering in a really helpful way. And so I just want to read you a sort of extended extract from his book. He writes this: you might wonder how this is comforting or helpful, praying, "You, Lord, reign forever," in the midst of suffering. And he says, life often feels like it's out of control. God may feel distant. Evil appears to be winning the day. He says, I'm sure you felt that way many times. I certainly have. Or maybe you're walking with someone whose storyline appears to be cruel. Lamentations shows us that God's sovereignty and his reign are not negated by suffering, and that God is still in control, even through loss. He says to lament is to affirm God's sovereignty when dark clouds linger. He goes on, I don't know how many times I've laid my head on the pillow at night and said, Lord, I'm trusting you're in control tonight. Each day is filled with great gaps of uncertainty. Pain makes the gulf wider and more overwhelming, but books like Lamentations help us to trust the God who wrote the rest of the story beyond chapter 5. Because he reigns even when the future is unclear. And then Mark Vrogrop goes on to point us to the New Testament, to Peter's speech in Acts chapter 2. And of course, if you know that bit of the Bible, you know that that was a speech made in the city of Jerusalem, in the heart of that city, in the temple court, in the city that in fact lies in ruins in Lamentations 5. And as Peter makes that speech, he says these words of Jesus to the assembled crowds. He says, this man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep his hold on him. And then Vrogrop goes on to observe, if God can take the most unjust moment in history and turn it into redemption, then surely we can say, you reign, Lord. Even when we can't imagine how God might use hard circumstances in our lives, we can still believe he's in control. In the midst of our sufferings, Lamentations 5 encourages us to pray, remember, Lord, what has happened to us. And to pray, you, Lord, reign forever. And then finally, restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. Have a look at Lamentations 5, verse 21 with me. Sorry, I've lost my page. Lamentations 5:21. Restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old. as this chapter starts to come into land, indeed as this book starts to come into land, we have this final desperate plea of the people of Jerusalem. Restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. And you notice all the things that their final prayer in this book is. And it isn't a request to end their physical exile. It's not a bring us home prayer primarily. Nor is it a request to change their bitter circumstances. Lord, would you just make life a little bit easier for us? It's not even a prayer saying, change us, Lord, that we might try a bit harder. No, they plead with God to do what he alone can do, to restore them to himself, to make it possible for them to return to him, to end their spiritual exile, to bring them back into divine favour. And if you're here this morning and you're looking into Christian things, we're in the dark place here in Lamentations 5, but in this verse, a light is being shone onto one of the key beliefs of the Christian faith. You see, the key thing for Christians is it's not that following Jesus is guaranteed to make your life better. Although often it will, as you live according to your Maker's instructions, you'll find that things go much better than they might do otherwise. But that's not the key thing. That's not why we're here this morning. Because our lives are sunny and complete. We wouldn't be in Lamentations if that was the case. No, the key thing is that through Jesus, we, Christians, have found a way to be restored to God. To return to him. And that might even mean that your circumstances get worse rather than better. Not neutral, not better, but worse. But even if that's what it means, Christians are content, even joyful, because their most important relationship, their relationship with their Lord, their God, is restored. Amidst destruction that I can't imagine, that's what the people of Jerusalem longed for most of all. For God to hear their prayer, answer their plea, and bring the nightmare of being distanced from him to an end. But Lamentations 5 has one last cliffhanger for us. I'm sure you noticed it earlier, but let me read again from verse 21, that plea. Restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old. Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. Unless this time we've gone too far. And that's it. That's the end of Lamentations. There's no answer from God giving us the resolution we'd long to hear. He's completely silent as the ball rests in his court. And that's a tension that the people have to live with, because as the poet has admitted time and time again in Lamentations, they do deserve to be on the end of God's judgment. They have, to turn the language around, utterly rejected God. And so their concern in verse 22 is not unfounded. They are in desperate need of the Lord to restore them to himself. And before we wish away the silence of God here at the end of Lamentations, there is something helpful about it. Because do you know what it means? It means it's okay for us to express a full measure of grief towards God. Has anyone prayed a prayer like the, whatever it is, 10 pages of the book of Lamentations? Really poured your heart out to God and not receive a sort of easy resolution from him? You see, the silence of God at the end of Lamentations, it reassures us that that is okay. It's not something that's promised to us to have things tidily tied up. It's what the people of Lamentations Day experienced. But of course, Lamentations is not the end of the Bible, and although you turn the page and you don't find more Lamentations, you do find more of the story. And so this question of whether God is angry with us beyond measure no longer hangs over us. Because there was another time when God was silent in the face of someone questioning whether he had been rejected by the Lord. And as he hung on the cross, next to that thief who he remembered, what happened later? Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And in response to that loud plea, heaven was silent. No answer came. Silence from heaven, and then a few moments later, with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. And the very next thing Mark tells us happened. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And in that moment, the prayer of Lamentations 5 was answered. As Jesus, the Son of God, took upon himself willingly the wrath of God at our sin, our rebellion. That curtain in the rebuilt temple that kept God and his people safely apart is no more. It's torn open. The gates are thrown wide open. Because God's anger has been dealt with. God's anger is no more because it's been poured out on his Son. That most decisive act in all of history, as God does, verse 21, as he makes it possible for his people to return to him. That curtain torn in two is the most wonderful sign that not only does God remember, not only does God reign, but God also restores us that we may return. And so Lamentations 5, it speaks to us in our suffering, and it says, perhaps particularly if you're suffering as a consequence of your sin, it says, here are 3 things to pray. Remember, Lord, what has happened to us, what has happened to me. You, Lord, reign forever. Restore us, restore me to yourself, Lord, that I may return. Remember, you reign, restore. 3 prayers God loves to answer for us in our suffering.